You are listening to this for a reason, and I don't say that lightly. I spent most of my adult life counting on believers never hearing what I am about to say, and even more on them dismissing it if they did. The greatest advantage the Dark Kingdom ever had was not power, not demons, not rituals, it was familiarity. When something becomes familiar, it becomes invisible, and when it becomes invisible, it becomes untouchable. That is how wars are won without noise. Most Christians think spiritual attack looks dramatic, violent, obvious. That assumption alone kept entire generations exposed. We stopped building temples a long time ago. We stopped needing symbols, chants, or shadows. Homes became the new sanctuaries, not because they were unholy, but because they were trusted. You don't guard what you believe is safe. You don't question what feels normal. And you don't fight what you don't recognize as a battlefield. What I am about to expose is new, but it is hidden in plain sight, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. That is why this matters. That is why listening all the way through matters. Because once awareness enters a space, certain operations can no longer continue, and I know exactly which ones those are. When I was still on the other side, we had a phrase we used often in planning rooms: never confront belief head on, redirect attention. Confrontation creates resistance. Resistance strengthens faith. But distraction dissolves it quietly. We studied believers carefully, how they lived, where they rested, what they repeated daily. We weren't interested in churches nearly as much as we were interested in kitchens, bedrooms, living rooms. The most successful operations never looked spiritual at all. They looked domestic, ordinary, harmless. That's the genius of it, if I am being honest. And that honesty is not comfortable for me, but it is necessary for you. Because if I were still doing what I used to do, I would pray you never hear this message. I would hope you keep assuming the danger is somewhere else, somewhere darker, somewhere more obvious. The truth is far more inconvenient than that. Let me say this clearly before we go any further. Most Christians are not being attacked the way they think they are. They are being accommodated, slowly, patiently, strategically. The Dark Kingdom learned long ago that pressure creates pushback, but comfort creates compliance. So the strategy shifted. Instead of trying to pull believers out of faith, we learned how to keep them inside it, busy, distracted, tired, emotionally saturated, spiritually passive. Faith that is unfocused is far easier to manage than faith that is broken. That realization changed everything. That is when household objects became far more valuable than any ritual tool we had ever used. And there were three in particular that consistently produced results across cultures, denominations, and age groups. Three objects that never raised suspicion, never triggered alarm, and never required force. You already interact with all three. That is not a threat. It is a fact. Before I explain them, understand this. Nothing I am sharing comes from speculation. This comes from years of observing outcomes, adjusting methods, reviewing failures and successes. I wasn't involved in theatrics. I was involved in patterns. My responsibility was to identify what worked repeatedly and why. And what worked best were not objects themselves, but what people unknowingly gave to those objects attention, emotion, agreement. An altar does. Tea need candles or incantations? An altar needs consistency. That is it. Give something consistent attention and emotional weight, and it begins to shape you. Shape leads to influence. Influence leads to direction. Direction leads to outcome. That sequence never fails. We relied on it more than anything else. If you are still listening, this is the moment where most people would want reassurance. Something to soften the weight of what is coming. I want to that, not because I want to scare you, but because this conversation deserves respect. You are capable of handling truth without theatrics. And if you want to stay ahead, if you want to understand what has been planned, not just what has happened, then you need to be connected to conversations like this consistently. That is why I'll say this once plainly: subscribe, not out of fear, but out of preparedness. The Dark Kingdom plans in seasons. Missing one briefing means being behind an entire cycle. Staying informed is not obsession, it is stewardship. And silence has always been our greatest ally. Awareness disrupts decades of work. When people hear my background, they often expect drama stories of rituals, chaos, darkness. The reality was far more methodical. Most days were spent analyzing data, behavior, habits. I was part of what you could call a domestic intelligence division. Our focus was infiltration through routine. We tracked how long it took for a habit to become invisible, how repetition shaped belief, how emotional states at certain times of day created openness. One of my colleagues, highly effective, rarely spoke about demons at all. His assignments weren't individuals, but environments. He once told me, if the environment agrees with us, the person will follow eventually. And he was right. I watched marriages erode, callings dull, prayer lives quiet, not because anyone chose rebellion, but because their daily patterns slowly trained them to stop paying attention. There was a particular operation I remember clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because of how subtle it was. A household deeply involved in church, generous, disciplined. On paper, they were untouchable. No scandal, no secret addictions, no obvious cracks. We did touch the church side of their lives at all. We studied what they did when no one was watching, where their eyes rested at the end of the day, what thoughts they carried into sleep, what emotions they rehearsed in silence. Months went by with no visible change, then one decision shifted, then another. Within a year, nothing bad had happened, but something vital had gone quiet. That was considered a success, not destruction. Neutralization. The Dark Kingdom prefers believers who are sincere but ineffective. They dawn to disrupt systems. They dawn to threaten strategy. They stay busy. You need to understand something important here, and this is where most people misunderstand how spiritual influence actually works. We were never interested in forcing anyone to do anything. Force leaves evidence. Influence leaves confusion. Confusion keeps people questioning themselves instead of the source. That is why the objects I am going to talk about were so effective. They did demand worship. They invited agreement. Subtle agreement repeated daily is more powerful than dramatic rebellion. Every time a believer unknowingly agrees with fear, distraction, self-focus, or emotional saturation, ground is yielded not dramatically, but incrementally. And increments are easier to defend because they feel insignificant. That is how territory changes hands without alarms. At some point, you may be asking yourself why this matters now. Why speak up after all these years? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. The cycles are accelerating. What used to take decades now takes years. What took years now takes months. And the window for ignorance is closing. Awareness is spreading faster than we anticipated. And when awareness spreads, strategies must be exposed before they are abandoned. That is why I am speaking, not to glorify the Dark Kingdom, but to render certain methods obsolete. Once a believer understands how an altar functions, it loses leverage. And leverage is everything in this kind of warfare. I want you to notice how you're feeling as you listen. Not fear. Most people don't feel fear at this point. It is usually recognition. A quiet sense of this explains some things. That recognition is dangerous to the Dark Kingdom. It also empowering to you. Because nothing I am describing requires you to be afraid. It requires you to be attentive. That's it. Attentiveness breaks patterns faster than resistance ever could. We counted on believers being tired, rushed, overstimulated. We did not count on them being attentive. That was always the variable that disrupted operation. And here is the part most people never expect me to say. If I were in your place, hearing this for the first time, I would rush to remove anything from my home. I would panic or start declaring war on objects. That reaction plays into misunderstanding. Objects guarantee the power. Agreement is. Attention is. Authority shifts the moment you recognize where those two have been misplaced. That is why the 3 household objects I am about to explain were never dangerous on their own. They became influential only when believers stopped questioning what they were giving to them daily. That is where the Dark Kingdom always works in the unquestioned spaces. In a moment, I am going to begin breaking down the first object. And when I do, some of you will feel exposed, not accused, but sane. That reaction is important. Don't resist it. Let it teach you. Remember, nothing has gone wrong because you are hearing this. In fact, the opposite is true. The fact that you are still listening means something has already shifted. And once that shift happens, certain doors can no longer remain open the way they were before. That is not a promise. It's an observation based on years of watching what awareness does to influence. Stay with me. What comes next is not dramatic, but it is precise, and precision has always been more powerful than noise. When people hear me talk about altars, their minds immediately go to stone structures, candles, blood, chants, things that look obviously spiritual. That misunderstanding is one of the greatest shields the Dark Kingdom ever had. We relied on it, because while believers were watching for symbols, we were studying systems. While they were praying against what looked evil, we were embedding influence into what felt ordinary. The truth is, an altar is not defined by appearance. It is defined by function. It is anything that consistently receives your attention, carries emotional weight, and quietly trains your agreement. Once those 3 elements align, influence begins to flow, whether the person involved believes in it or not. Belief was never a requirement for effectiveness. Consistency was. Inside our planning rooms, we did ask, is this object spiritual? We ask, does this object receive repeated focus without resistance? Resistance was the enemy. The moment a believer questioned something, measured it, prayed through it intentionally, its effectiveness dropped sharply. But anything that blended into routine, anything protected by habit, anything wrapped in comfort, That was where influence flourished. That is why domestic spaces became so important. Homes are where vigilance relaxes. Homes are where people stop performing and start repeating. And repetition, more than rebellion, is what reshapes spiritual posture over time. I need you to understand something about how we evaluated success, because it will help you see why the objects I about to describe were so carefully chosen. We did not measure outcomes by visible collapse. That was inefficient and drew attention. Our most successful operations ended with people still calling themselves believers, still attending church occasionally, still speaking the language of faith, but no longer advancing, no longer discerning, no longer carrying weight. From a strategic standpoint, that was ideal. A believer who thinks nothing is wrong is far easier to influence than one who knows they are under attack. That's why neutrality was often the goal. Silence, dullness, drift. Those were signs of progress. One of the first lessons I learned when I was promoted into a leadership role was that the dark kingdom does not rush what it can train. Speed creates suspicion. Slowness creates normalization. We were patient because we could afford to be. Most believers underestimated how much time was invested in understanding them. We knew their schedules, their emotional cycles, their stress points. We knew when they were most open, not spiritually open, but mentally unguarded. Late at night, early in the morning, moments of fatigue, moments of reward, moments when they felt they had earned rest. Those moments were gold, and the objects present in those moments became conduits. There was a period when my team was tasked with reviewing why certain households resisted influence more effectively than others. Same faith, same church, same resources, yet vastly different outcomes. The difference was not prayer volume or knowledge. It was attentiveness. The resistant households questioned their routines. They paid attention to what shaped their thoughts when no one else was around. They did demonize objects, but they did surrender awareness either. That made them difficult to work with. Influence struggled to anchor itself where awareness was active. That insight forced us to refine our approach even further. We stopped aiming for disruption and focused almost entirely on distraction. You see, distraction doesn't feel like compromise, it feels like relief. That's why it works. People don't guard what they believe is helping them cope. And that belief that something is helping creates loyalty. Loyalty leads to defense. Defense leads to blindness. By the time someone realizes they've been shaped, they usually blame themselves, not the system that trained them. That internalized blame was another layer of protection for our strategies. If a believer thinks the problem is their own weakness, they won't look outward. They'll try harder using the same patterns that weakened them in the first place. This is where the concept of household altars becomes uncomfortable, because it forces a redefinition of what spiritual engagement actually looks like. You don't kneel before these altars. You don't pray to them. You don't even respect them consciously. You simply give them time, emotion, mental space. And over time, they begin to set the tone for how you see yourself, how you process the world, and how responsive you are to spiritual prompting. That responsiveness or lack of it was one of our key metrics. When spiritual sensitivity dulls, influence encounters less friction. I remember a colleague of mine who was particularly skilled at mapping emotional patterns. He was interested in doctrine or theology. He studied moods. He could tell you what kind of content, object, or habit would resonate with someone based on how they felt at specific points in the day. His operations rarely involved introducing anything new. He amplified what was already there. That is another misconception people have. They think influence requires introduction. Most of the time, it requires amplification. Take something neutral, repeat it, attach emotion, remove questioning. Over time, it becomes formative. There was one assignment he handled that stayed with me. The objective was to lead someone into obvious sin or abandonment of faith. The objective was to reduce their spiritual responsiveness by 40% over 18 months. That was the language we used: percentages, timelines, benchmarks, the method, no dramatic changes. Just consistent exposure to environments that encourage passivity at the exact moments when the person was most emotionally open. 18 months later, the individual still believed, still prayed occasionally, but no longer sensed direction. They described feeling foggy, tired, unmotivated. From an operational standpoint, that was success. No scandal, no collapse, just quiet neutralization. I am telling you this not to glorify strategy, but to strip it of mystery. Mystery gives power. Clarity removes it. Once you understand that influence thrives on unexamined repetition, you begin to see why the three objects I am about to describe were so effective across cultures and generations. They did require belief. They required access, and access was always granted voluntarily. That is an important point. Nothing was forced. Everything was accepted. At this stage, Some of you may be feeling a growing sense of unease, not because anything evil has been named yet, but because you're beginning to realize how much of life runs on autopilot. Autopilot is convenient. It saves energy. It reduces friction. It also bypasses discernment. The Dark Kingdom loves autopilot. Anything that keeps a believer from being fully present is valuable. Presence disrupts patterns. Presence invites conviction. Presence restores authority. That is why presence was always quietly undermined. There is another layer to this that most people miss. These household altars did just shape individuals. They shaped atmospheres. Atmospheres influence everyone who enters them: children, spouses, guests. Over time, the emotional and mental tone of a home could be shifted without anyone ever agreeing verbally to anything. That is how influence spreads generationally without ever being named. The home feels a certain way. People adapt to that feeling. They assume it as normal. Normal becomes baseline. Baseline becomes unquestioned. And the cycle continues. You might be wondering why, if these strategies were so effective, they aren't discussed more openly now. The answer is simple. They lose effectiveness when named. Once a believer recognizes that attention itself is a form of agreement, they begin to steward it differently. Once they realize that rest can be hijacked, that comfort can condition, that neutrality can be cultivated intentionally, they regain agency. Agency is dangerous to any system that relies on passivity. That is why exposure matters. I also want to address something carefully here, because misunderstanding it could lead you in the wrong direction. This is not about becoming suspicious of everything in your home. Suspicion breeds fear, and fear is just another form of distraction. Fear still centers the object. The shift is not from comfort to paranoia. It is from unconscious engagement to conscious stewardship. That distinction matters. We exploited unconsciousness, not enjoyment. Enjoyment with awareness was far less effective than numb repetition without thought. As someone who once relied on these methods, I can tell you that the moment a believer pauses and asks, "What is this shaping in me?" the flow of influence weakens. It does require rituals to undo rituals. It requires attention. Attention is authority expressed quietly. And authority, when exercised calmly, destabilizes long-standing patterns faster than aggression ever could. I want you to hold on to that as we move forward, because what comes next will feel personal for many of you, not accusatory, but intimate. These objects are woven into daily life so deeply that most people have never considered their impact. That is by design. We counted on that. We depended on it. And yet, the moment you see the pattern, you step out of it. You don't have to destroy anything. You don't have to declare war. You simply have to stop giving unexamined agreement. In the next stretch of this conversation, I am going to begin with the first object, and I'll explain why it was prioritized so highly, especially among believers who appeared disciplined, sincere, and spiritually active. That detail surprises most people, because the Dark Kingdom never aimed first at the weak. It aimed at the unaware. And awareness right now is beginning to return. The first object we prioritized was not chosen because it looked powerful, but because it was trusted implicitly. It was present in almost every home, used daily, and rarely questioned. More importantly, it shaped identity without announcing that it was doing so. Identity is always the first battlefield, because once identity is influenced, decisions follow naturally. We understood that believers who knew who they were resilient, but believers who were subtly trained to question, admire, criticize, or measure themselves constantly became internally divided. Division does have to be dramatic to be effective. It just has to be constant. That object was the mirror. Most people think of mirrors as neutral tools, simple reflections, but reflection is never passive. What you look at repeatedly teaches you what to prioritize. The mirror never demanded worship. It invited evaluation. Evaluation can be healthy, but repetition without grounding turns evaluation into fixation. We observed that the mirror became most effective when it was encountered in moments of vulnerability, early morning, late night, moments of emotional fluctuation. In those moments, people weren't just seeing their faces. They're negotiating worth, confidence, regret, pride, insecurity. The mirror became a silent conversation partner, one that never corrected false narratives. If someone stood there rehearsing criticism, the mirror agreed by remaining silent. If someone rehearsed pride, the mirror also agreed. Silence is a powerful form of consent. We noticed that believers who spent unexamined time in front of mirrors often carried those internal conversations into prayer, relationships, and decision-making. The issue was never appearance, it was attention. The mirror trained people to look inward constantly without anchoring that reflection in truth. Over time, that inward focus subtly replaced outward attentiveness. Self-awareness drifted into self-absorption or self-rejection, depending on the personality. Either direction reduced spiritual responsiveness. A believer preoccupied with self is slower to notice prompting, conviction, or direction. That slowness was measurable. we tracked it. There was a case early in my career where a highly committed believer showed no obvious vulnerabilities. Strong marriage, disciplined habits, consistent prayer. We struggled to find an entry point. Eventually, the focus shifted to identity reinforcement. Nothing dramatic was introduced. The mirror did the work. Over time, internal narratives grew louder. Not sinful, just distracting. Subtle comparison, subtle dissatisfaction, subtle pride, masked as self-improvement. The individual did fall. They stalled. And stalling was enough. The second object was even more effective because it intersected with the most defenseless state a person enters daily. Sleep is not just rest. It is surrender. When you sleep, you yield control. That vulnerability is necessary, but it is also influential. The bed became a critical altar not because of what happened physically, but because of what was carried mentally into it. We weren't as interested in actions as we were in residue, what thoughts were rehearsed before sleep, what emotions were unresolved, what narratives were replayed. The bed stored those things quietly. We learned that whatever dominated a person as thoughts before sleep often shaped their emotional tone the next day. That emotional tone influenced decisions, patience, clarity, and spiritual sensitivity. The bed did. To need to host obvious immorality to be effective. It only needed to host unprocessed emotion consistently. Anxiety carried into sleep becomes normalized. Resentment carried into sleep becomes familiar. Familiarity breeds acceptance. Acceptance dulls urgency. I remember a coworker assigned to observe nighttime patterns. His reports were unsettling in their simplicity. He noted that believers often prayed briefly at night, but then immediately rehearsed worries, entertainment, or internal conflicts as they lay down. Prayer became the transition, not the anchor. The last dominant input mattered most. Over time, the bed became associated with mental noise rather than peace. That association trained the nervous system, which in turn influenced spiritual attentiveness. A tired, emotionally saturated believer is not powerless, but they are less perceptive. Perception was always the goal. One particular mission stands out. The target was a household, not an individual. No obvious dysfunction. Children raised in faith. The strategy focused entirely on nighttime routines. Gradual introduction of stimulation before bed, reduced silence, less stillness, no overt darkness, just noise. Months passed. Nothing bad happened, but the atmosphere shifted. Restlessness increased. Irritability followed. Prayer became shorter, more mechanical. Eventually, important conversations were avoided because everyone felt too tired. That fatigue was accidental. It was cultivated. The bed had become an altar of unrest, not by intention, but by repetition. The third object surpassed all others in effectiveness because it combined accessibility, emotional stimulation, and voluntary engagement. It required no coercion. People defended it passionately. It followed them everywhere. The screen was never just a tool, it was an environment. We understood early on that whoever shaped the environment shaped the outcomes. The screen created a portable environment that could be entered at will. That was unprecedented. The Dark Kingdom was never interested in content alone. Content was secondary. What mattered was rhythm, frequency, duration, emotional engagement. The screen trained attention spans, emotional responses, and tolerance levels. It normalized constant input. Silence became uncomfortable. Stillness felt unproductive. Reflection was crowded out. Over time, the ability to sit with one's thoughts diminished. That one's to accidental. A believer who cannot sit in silence struggles to discern subtle prompting. Noise does. To have to be evil to be effective. It just has to be constant. We studied how long it took for screens to become reflexive. Without thinking, scroll without intention, watch without choosing. That reflex bypassed discernment entirely. People believed they were resting, but their minds were being trained continuously. Training shapes instincts. Instincts guide reactions. Reactions determine direction. The screen became the most effective altar because it disguised itself as relief. There was a period when we tested different categories of content, expecting certain types to be more effective. The results surprised many. Even neutral or positive content, when consumed excessively and without intention, produced passivity. The issue was not morality, it was saturation. Emotional saturation reduces sensitivity. Sensitivity is essential for spiritual alertness. Once sensitivity dulls, influence encounters less resistance. I worked alongside someone whose sole responsibility was measuring engagement decay. He tracked how quickly people lost the ability to focus on one thing without stimulation. His findings were clear. The more fragmented attention became, the harder it was for people to maintain spiritual discipline. Not because they did care, but because they were trained to seek constant novelty. Novelty weakens perseverance. Perseverance is necessary for depth. What made the screen especially powerful was that it followed people into the other two spaces. It stood in front of the mirror, It entered the bed. It layered influence, identity, rest, attentional intersected. That convergence accelerated outcomes. We did to need to invent new strategies. We just needed to observe how people used what they already loved. At this point, some of you may feel a mix of discomfort and clarity. That is natural. Recognition often feels like exposure. But this is about blame. It is about understanding mechanisms. Once you understand how influence flows, you can interrupt it calmly. The Dark Kingdom never feared loud resistance. It feared quiet awareness. Awareness changes how attention is given. Attention, once stewarded, loses its exploitability. If I were standing where you are now, hearing this with fresh ears, I would rush to remove mirrors, throw away screens, or fear my bed. That reaction misunderstands the issue. Objects are neutral until agreement is given unconsciously. The shift begins when you reclaim intentionality, when you decide where your attention rests, what emotions you carry into rest, how you engage with reflection. That decision restores agency. Agency disrupts patterns. I've watched entire strategies collapse when believers became attentive without becoming anxious. Anxiety feeds distraction. Attentiveness restores order. Order strengthens authority. Authority does need to announce itself. It simply changes the environment. And environments shape outcomes faster than effort ever could. What you've heard so far is not meant to leave you uneasy, but equipped. You now understand why the most effective altars never looked spiritual. They look normal, comfortable, helpful. And that understanding alone already weakens their influence because nothing thrives in the light of awareness for long. There is one final piece to this conversation, and it is the most important. Knowing how influence works is only half the picture. Understanding how to respond without overcorrecting is what determines whether awareness leads to freedom or fear. In the next stretch, I'm going to speak from a different posture, not as an analyst of past strategies, but as someone who has stood where you stand now and asked a simple question: if I were rebuilding spiritual authority in my own home, what would I do first, and why? When I stepped away from everything I once helped build, the most difficult adjustment was not fear or regret, but relearning how to live without constant analysis. For years, I saw environments as systems and people as patterns. Walking away did erase that instinct, but it did change how I applied it. And when I imagine myself on the other side of this conversation, sitting where you are now, hearing what you just heard, the question that mattered most once, what to remove, but what to restore. Authority is something you hunt for. It's something that returns when alignment is restored. And alignment begins with attention. If I were rebuilding spiritual authority in my own home, I would start by slowing everything down internally before changing anything externally. Speed creates reaction. Reaction creates overcorrection. Overcorrection often replaces one form of distraction with another. The Dark Kingdom thrives just as well on fear-driven behavior as it does on passivity. What disrupts influence is not intensity but clarity. Clarity allows you to see without panicking. Panic scatters attention. Clarity gathers it. The first thing I would do is quietly audit where my attention naturally flows when no one is watching. Not with judgment, not with guilt, but with honesty. Attention reveals agreement. Whatever repeatedly captures your attention is shaping you, whether you approve of it or not. That doesn't mean attention itself is evil. It means it is powerful. Power requires stewardship. When attention is stewarded intentionally, influence loses its grip. When attention is scattered unconsciously, influence multiplies without resistance. I would pay close attention to transitions. Transitions are where habits live. The moments between waking and working, between finishing a day and resting, between silence and stimulation. Those moments often determine the tone of everything that follows. We exploited transitions constantly because people rarely guarded them. They felt insignificant. But transitions set posture. Posture determines responsiveness. Responsiveness determines direction. If I noticed that my mornings began with self-evaluation rather than grounding, I would condemn myself. I would re-anchor. If I noticed that my nights ended with noise rather than stillness, I would panic. I would adjust. Influence weakens when patterns are interrupted gently but consistently. Violence against routine isn't necessary. Awareness is enough. One of the biggest misconceptions believers have is that spiritual authority requires forceful declaration. In reality, authority expresses itself most powerfully through consistency. Quiet consistency reshapes environments over time. It does announce itself. It does argue. It simply changes what feels normal. That is what the Dark Kingdom did so effectively. And it is what can be undone just as effectively, but in the opposite direction. I would also be careful not to turn this awareness into obsession. Obsession keeps the focus on the object. Stewardship shifts focus back to self-governance. The goal is not to fear mirrors, beds, or screens. The goal is to reclaim the ability to choose how you engage with them. Choice restores dignity. Dignity strengthens identity. Identity anchors authority. One of the most powerful shifts I witnessed after leaving was realizing how much influence collapses when believers stop reacting emotionally to exposure and start responding thoughtfully. Reaction feeds the system. Thoughtful response dismantles it. That is why, if I were in your place, I would resist the urge to make dramatic changes all at once. Dramatic change often burns out. Sustainable change reshapes atmosphere. I would begin by reclaiming silence in small, manageable ways. Silence is not emptiness. It is space. Space allows truth to surface without force. Silence makes room for awareness. Awareness invites discernment. Discernment restores direction. We work tirelessly to crowd out silence because silence invites clarity. Clarity was always the threat. Rest would also become intentional again, not just physical rest, but mental rest. Rest that doesn't rely on constant input. Rest that allows the nervous system to settle rather than stimulate. That kind of rest restores sensitivity. Sensitivity increases responsiveness. Responsiveness strengthens spiritual perception. A well-rested believer is far more disruptive to influence than an exhausted one. I would also begin to ask different questions, not of objects, but of myself. Not, is this bad? But what is this shaping in me? Not, should I remove this? But am I engaging with this consciously or reflexively? Those questions shift power immediately. Reflex is exploitable. Conscious choice is not. There is something deeply stabilizing that happens when believers reclaim authorship over their attention. They stop being shaped by default and start shaping their environment intentionally. Children feel it. Homes feel it. Conversations shift. Not dramatically at first, but noticeably, atmospheres become calmer. Decisions become clearer. Prayer becomes less strained, not because effort increased, but because noise decreased. I've seen homes change without a single object being removed, simply because the people inside them became present again. Presence is disruptive to any system built on distraction. Presence restores alignment between belief and behavior. That alignment is what gives faith weight. Weight is what we worked so hard to reduce. Another important thing I would do is resist isolation. Influence thrives in secrecy and silence. Awareness grows in shared understanding. That does mean broadcasting fear or turning every conversation into a warning. It means having honest, grounded conversations with trusted people. Shared awareness creates shared resistance. Resistance does have to be loud. It just has to be consistent. I would also remember that authority is not something you regain overnight. It returns as trust is rebuilt within yourself. Trust that you can steward your attention. Trust that you can rest without numbing. Trust that you can reflect without spiraling inward. That trust grows through practice, not perfection. There is a reason the Dark Kingdom focused so heavily on habits rather than beliefs. Habits outlast motivation. Beliefs can be affirmed verbally, while habits tell a different story. When habits change, beliefs regain coherence. Coherence restores confidence. Confidence strengthens action. Action reshapes outcomes. As someone who once measured effectiveness in terms of passivity, I can tell you this with certainty. An attentive believer is a problem. Not because they are aggressive, but because they are grounded. Grounded people don't overreact. They don't get swept up easily. They notice when something feels off. That noticing alone interrupts influence. This is also why I would caution against turning this information into fear-driven vigilance. Fear narrows focus. Narrow focus misses nuance. Nuance matters. The Dark Kingdom is not defeated by panic. It is disrupted by wisdom. Wisdom moves slowly, but it moves deeply. If you feel a sense of responsibility rising as you listen, that is not burden. That is agency returning. Agency does demand that you fix everything at once. It invites you to steward what is already in your care. Stewardship is patient. It grows over time, and it produces lasting change. As this conversation comes to a close, I want you to understand something important. Nothing I've shared means you have failed. It means you've been living in systems designed to operate quietly. Recognizing those systems is not an indictment. It's an invitation. An invitation to live more intentionally, more attentively, more aligned. You don't need to be afraid of the Dark Kingdom to stay ahead of it. Fear gives it more attention than it deserves. Understanding deprives it of leverage. And understanding grows when you stay informed, when you stay connected to conversations that pull back the curtain without sensationalism. That's why I'll say this again, not as a marketer, but as someone who once relied on silence to keep these strategies effective. Stay connected. Subscribe, not because you were behind, but because staying ahead requires continuity. The moment you stop paying attention is the moment patterns begin to reassert themselves quietly. Share this not to alarm, but to equip. Awareness spreads faster than influence ever can. The more people understand how their attention shapes their environment, the less effective these strategies become. That's not optimism. That's observation. There is much more to unpack in future conversations: why certain spiritual practices were tolerated while others were resisted, why noise was encouraged over depth, why busyness was one of our most effective tools. But for now, what matters is this: you see the pattern. And once you see it, you are no longer operating blindly. The Dark Kingdom plans in seasons. Awareness disrupts seasons. Stay aware. Stay grounded. And remember, the most powerful shift you can make is not dramatic. It's intentional.